Thank you very much. We're Tatjana, Mindt, and myself, Elen and Foll. We're very pleased to be able to present some work that we've been conducting, comparing if-conditionals in EFL textbooks, in EFL examinations, and in real-life English usage, a term we've used for lack of a better word, real life in quotation mark. So when we think of if-conditionals in the context of English as a foreign language, you might think of prototypical sentences like, if I were president, there would be no school ever, which is one that we found in one of the textbooks that we looked at. And in general, in the ELT context, there's a typology of conditionals that's found consensus in both textbooks and learner grammars. Usually this is a typology that distinguishes 3 to 4 types of conditionals, and each type is distinguished by both the combination of verb tenses and modals in each clause. So here in my example, we have the subjunctive were in the if clause and a would plus infinitive in the main clause, as well as the meaning of these if statements, so degrees of likelihood and hypotheticality. So the traditional ELT typology of conditionals, I'm sure you're familiar with very briefly. Type 1 is this present simple plus will infinitive and refers to situations that are likely to become true in the future or in the present. It's a predictive function. Then we have type 2, which corresponds to the example that we had in our title slide. If I were president, there would be no school ever. So this is a more unlikely hypothetical situation. And then we have type 3 conditionals, where we have an unreal or hypothetical situation in the past, a counterfactual statement, and that's characterized by the if plus past perfect and then would have plus infinitive. Some textbooks and learner grammars also add a type 0 conditional or a general truth conditional with simple present in both clauses, but not all textbooks. And indeed, we can say that although we have this sort of consensual ELT typology, there is quite a bit of flexibility. So some textbooks and learner grammars will add more or fewer or none at all modal verbs in some of these types, and not all textbooks refer to them as type 1, 2, and 3. So here we have an example from a French textbook where clearly they are referring to and describing type 1, type 2, and type 3, but they're not actually calling them types 1, 2, and 3. There have already been a number of corpus-based studies that have looked at the suitability of this ELT typology. And I don't have time, or we don't have time to summarize all of these studies, but in brief, we can say that they all come to the conclusion that this ELT typology doesn't represent the range of conditionals that are actually used in real life English particularly well. What we're doing in this particular study is we are on the one hand looking at how suitable or how representative the ELT typology of conditionals is in real life English, which we define as English used outside the classroom. But we're also looking at the extent to which the ELT typology applies to the language of secondary school textbooks themselves. So beyond just the grammar section, where clearly that is the typology they use, but within the rest of the text, and including the audio material that Lisa also looks at, the CDs and the videos that belong to the textbooks, how if conditionals are used there. And then we add a third data set with looking at the written production of French EFL learners. And here we're not looking at learners that are working with exactly the textbooks that we're looking at, but rather we're interested in finding out whether English speakers who've learned English at school using presumably very similar textbooks to the ones we're looking at are still influenced by the ELT typology as young adults or older adults, having been exposed presumably to other sources of language, English language input. And now Tatjana is going to present our data and methods. I don't think it's working.
Well, anyway, in order to do that, we analyzed and compared if conditionals across 4 corpora representing firstly textbook English, French learner English, and real English in like alphabetical. And we, well, first we analyzed the French subcorpus of the tech, which is part of a larger textbook English corpus created by Elen. And the subcorpus comprises 3 textbook series, 14 volumes in total, from 3 French textbook publishers. And then we analyzed the subcorpus of the Open Cambridge Learner Corpus, which consists of exam texts written by French nationals. The corpus represents proficiency levels B1 to C2. And most of these productions are from young adults, but also older learners. And yeah, these learners can be expected to have worked with similar materials in secondary school. For our real English, we used 2 reference corpora. Firstly, a stratified sample of the B and C, stratified because it contains 7 registers, as you can see. Yeah, sorry. And also the N10-10-15, which is a large web corpus. And we decided to also use a web corpus because these corpora generally contain a larger proportion of interactional language, meaning texts from other registers, internet registers, blog posts, forum discussions, and so on, as well as text produced by native and non-native speakers of English. And as we have seen at the beginning of this conference, coming language teaching wants learners to develop an understanding of new media and different registers, as well as an awareness of different socio-cultural and geographical varieties of English. So we thought it would be adequate to combine both the native British, the standard native British native speaker norm, sorry, and more varied global Englishes. Right, then we extracted all instances of the word if from the tag FR, the French subcorpus of the textbook corpus. And after manual filtering, there were 620 if conditionals left. So we did the same for the other 3 corpora and arrived at the same number and reduced it to the same number of conditionals. And then all 4 sets of if sentences were manually annotated for firstly tense forms and aspects and modal verbs, fixed idiomatic constructions, the time reference of each clause, so present, future, past, the corresponding ELT type if applicable, and the meaning-based type. And there we used a simplified version of the typology, which I will explain on the next slide. Now, this typology was proposed by Athanasiadou and Durbin, and it focuses on meanings rather than tense form combinations. It consists of, or it has 3 main types: CECs, cause of events conditionals, hypothetical conditionals, HCs, and pragmatic conditionals, PCs, which is again subdivided into 2 subtypes, logical and conversational conditionals. Now, with regard to meaning, CECs correspond more or less to ELT type 0, the general one, even though its form can vary, as we'll see later. And hypothetical conditionals express a certain degree of likelihood or hypotheticality. So that type technically comprises all of comprises ELT types 1 to 3 in one category. And in both CECs and HCs, we've got a direct link between the 2 clauses. So, and this is not the case for logical conditionals, because there we don't have a direct cause-effect link between the clauses, but the link is based on the mental process of inference. Now, if you look at the example sentence, for instance, if birds can fly, why should men? The speaker takes the truth of the if clause for granted and or assumes it to be believed by the the hero or someone else. And then conversational pragmatic conditionals have an even more indirect link between the clauses because it requires pragmatic enrichment to understand the implied speech act. Now, this is quite a heterogeneous category because it includes cases like the example sentence, where the if clause clarifies in what way the preposition in the main clause is relevant. But it also includes politeness conditionals, if I may say so, or comments on the wording of the speech act itself, if it's the right word, for instance. All right, and now I will go over to Elen, who will talk about the results.
Yes, on to some results. There are many, so we'll just give you a brief overview of some of the key results. And the first thing we looked at is how the ELT types are distributed in our four corpus samples. And so what you can see on this first graph at the bottom here, 0 refers to type 0, so there's general truth conditional, type 1 is in orange, type 2 in grey, type 3 in yellow. And the question is, what are those big light blue bars? And those are all of the if conditionals which are not covered by the ELT typology. And so we see that in both the reference data and in the learner English data, about 2/3 of if conditionals can't be explained with the sort of traditional ELT typology. But what's maybe more remarkable is that even within the textbooks themselves, 43% can't be explained. So we have the textbooks that at the back of the textbook in the grammar section explain a typology that they then don't apply themselves in the text that they present within the textbooks themselves. Then if we look at the types that are found, evidently we then see an overrepresentation of type 1 and 2 in the textbooks as compared to our reference data, because obviously those are the ones in the typology. Type 3 is very infrequent in both the reference and the learner data. And in general, we find an underrepresentation of type 0 in textbooks. And as we explained, type 0 is not always included in the grammar sections. But the most remarkable finding there, which I think we can say really did surprise us, is seeing that the typology in the textbooks covers just over half of if conditionals. Where we do find those if conditionals that fit in the typology is mostly in exercises, in these kinds of gap fills, so without very much context. And so it's really about learners plotting in the right form into these gaps, and there's not much, if any, emphasis on meaning. We also looked at the distribution of verb form patterns. So the ELT typology combines both the verb form patterns and the meaning. Looking just at the verb form patterns, we find that learners' use of these various verb form patterns is actually closer to real life language use than the textbooks. We had a few surprising findings was, for example, that learners use present quite a bit more, and also present imperative as verb combinations. We find that in general, the modalized if clauses in the learner data and in the textbook data tend to really stick to can and could as the two modals, whereas the reference data has a much greater variety of modals and semi-modals. Then we looked at the distribution of meaning-based types. So according to the typology that Tatjana just outlined, here, unsurprisingly, we find an overrepresentation of conditionals, of hypothetical conditionals in the textbook data, because that is what they focus on when they mean if conditionals. We find an underrepresentation of the other types, in particular of the general truth, really, this course event, and also of conversational conditionals. Surprisingly, we find that learners are actually using a lot of these conversational conditionals, even though they're not very present in the textbooks. When we look at what that looks like, it's a lot of quite formulaic phrases which learners have obviously acquired somewhere, and which they are using, at least in these written exams. Things like, and if you agree, I'd rather take this job than the other one. And then we looked at a few patterns that we found particularly interesting. So the present and then will plus infinitive pattern is one such example, because according to the typology, that's a pattern which looks at or depicts hypotheses that are possible, likely in the future. And we have an example here from one of our textbooks. And then as opposed to the type 0, where if it is explained at all, that's the one that's used for general validity statements with present simple plus present simple in both clauses. When we actually looked at the real life data, we found many examples where actually we had a mixture of these two types. We have things like if a child is not developing an arc by 3 years of age, we will often fit the child with a shoe insert. And so here, clearly, this is a general truth statement, and yet the author is using will in the main clause. And this is not a rare phenomenon. So if we look only at the if conditionals with this pattern, present and will infinitive, we find those are the yellow bars that in our reference data, quite a few of them actually refer to general statements. So course of event conditionals here, very few in the textbooks. And this is where, when we looked at the learner data combined, it was somewhere in between. And then we subdivided it again according to proficiency levels. And that's where we found that the lower proficiency learners in our sample, and they're not beginners, B1, B2, are not using this pattern very much for this meaning. And yet as they get more advanced, then they start using it a lot more. So that's an interesting possible influence of the ELT typology. And another such example is the use of the simple past in the if clause. So according to the ELT typology, the simple past form, I should add, is used in this hypothetical meaning, if rich countries weren't so greedy, as opposed to a temporal past time. But in our reference data, we found a lot of instances of this past tense being used in an if clause to actually refer to the past tense. And that's something that's, again, not accounted for in the ELT typology, but which is not rare, as we found in our data. But this is something that learners are not using, or seemingly not using, at least in our data. So what can we draw for, in terms of conclusion? Tatjana will tell us more.
Yeah, well, now after looking at the results, we've seen that the common explicit ELT typology, at least, is not a very accurate representation of how if conditionals are used outside the classroom, because it doesn't account for other forms frequently used in real English. And apart from this interesting finding that conditionals that do not conform to the traditional typology still make up around 43% of the TEC-FR. So there we can conclude that even though the typology outlined in the textbook's grammar sections is very restricted, French EFL textbooks still present learners with a variety of conditional sentences other than the traditional types 1 to 3 or 0 in their text passages. And as for question 1C and research question 2, in many respects, the learners' use of conditionals was very similar to what we observed in our reference corpora, especially when it comes to the frequencies of type 0 and type 3. So the influence of the teaching norm is evident in some, but not in all of the aspects mentioned before. And because learners are clearly able to use a much greater variety of forms and meanings of conditionals than those they were very likely exposed to in textbooks. And well, the strongest influence we observed was the simple past in learners' if clauses, as Elen has just told you. And it seems like the explicitly taught textbook typology strongly implies that each kind of verb form combination is inherently connected to an obligatory verb form pattern, which is quite misleading. Now, what does this mean for English language teaching? Well, we propose that the common ELT typology of conditionals should be revised and adapted, in that type 0 and other frequently occurring patterns should be more prominently featured, like present plus imperative, modalized if clauses, or conditionals with elliptical clauses. And rather than asking students to adopt rigid formal rules, we think that the pedagogical focus should shift from form to the range of meanings that can be communicated by conditionals. A study by Jacobson, for instance, has shown that this could be achieved by adopting a cognitive model of conditionals, for instance, where which emphasizes the components of meanings that determine the forms of conditional, like the discourse context, the speaker's perspective, and the context. And anyway, any typology should make clear that a particular combination is not just, it's not in itself wrong just because it doesn't correspond to any predefined pattern. And it should be complemented with real-life examples and contextualized exercises, ideally created on the basis of corpus data. Then one could ask the question of whether the textbook's strong focus on type 3 is justified. Because on the one hand, one could say that it could just be left out since it's not very frequent, as we have seen in both of our reference corpora. But on our analysis of the learner corpus has also shown that many of the learners seem to struggle with the formal aspects of this type. And like in this example sentence, we had to stop many times and we arrived in the nick of time, but it would be easier if the meeting point was not so far. So this is clearly an attempt to produce a type 3 conditional, but it wasn't very successful. And well, so on the other hand, you could also say that the strong focus on this type in textbook is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is at what age or at what level it should be introduced to the learners. But this might be something we can discuss afterwards. And another advantage of using learner corpora, like we did, is that enables researchers, teachers, and also textbook authors to anticipate potential learner difficulties and to identify L1 or school language interferences. For example, we noticed that the French learners in our subcorpus frequently used even if conditionals quite a lot, and we think, like in this example sentence. And we think that this might be because the French has an analogous construction, même si, which is much more frequent in French than even is in English. And so this might be an instance of negative interference. And we see similar thing with German learners' use of when with conditional meaning, for instance. When with conditional meaning, for instance, because German has wenn, which can correspond to both when and if, depending on context. All right, that's it from us. And thank you for your attention. We're looking forward to your questions and comments.